14 years after Detective Michael Hale vanished, the river coughed up his badge in a rusted tackle box, cleaned but still scarred like the city that forgot him. If the water kept his secret this long, what else is buried in the silt? And who was waiting on the dock the night he never came home? The morning of June 6th, in 1983 began like any other inside the Major Crimes Unit. The walls of the briefing room hummed with the low sound of chatter, chairs scraping against the tiled floor as detectives carried their coffee in paper cups and shuffled thick files between their hands. The clock on the wall ticked with the steady rhythm of routine, each second marking the approach of the 8 o'clock roll call. It was a ritual carved into the bones of the department. Attendance was never optional, punctuality was never questioned. On this day, though, the ritual cracked. When the sergeant read out Detective Michael Hale, the space where his voice should have been met only silence, every head turned instinctively toward the chair at the far side of the table, the one Hale had claimed for years, worn in by his weight and his habits. It was empty, as if erased. At first, the silence was shrugged off with a murmur of surprise. Hale was reliable, known for arriving early enough to pour his second cup of coffee before the others even filed in. The sergeant cleared his throat and moved on, but the unease stuck to the walls like static. A missing man in a unit that lived and breathed precision was more than an oddity. It was a violation of the order that held them together. By the time the briefing ended, the silence of Hale's chair had grown into something larger, an unspoken question none of them wanted to say out loud. Where was he? The first calls went out from the desk phone, the familiar sequence of numbers dialed quickly and without thought. They rang once, twice, then slid into the flat voice of a full voicemail box. The officer at the phone frowned, tried again, got the same result. Hale's personal line returned the same dead end, no chance even to leave a message. One of the detectives volunteered to swing by Hale's apartment on his way to an errand, only to report back that the blinds were drawn, the mailbox stuffed with yesterday's paper, and the unmarked Ford he always drove was nowhere in sight. It was not the picture of a man who had overslept or missed his alarm. It was the picture of a man who had slipped out of view altogether. By mid-morning, the talk around the squad room had turned from casual curiosity to tight-lipped worry. The detectives traded fragments of memory like puzzle pieces, trying to recall if Hale had mentioned a trip, a family emergency, anything that might explain the absence. No one could think of a single thing. His calendar had been full of case notes, his desk stacked neatly with files he intended to review. His name had been penciled onto the afternoon rotation for interviews. There was no sign of preparation for time off. No hints left in the way he had packed his desk or spoken the night before. The hole he left behind was sudden and sharp, like a chair pulled out from under them mid-sentence. By noon, the whispers had hardened into something colder. A missing detective was not just a personal concern but a threat to the rhythm of the unit, a crack in the spine of trust they all leaned on. Hale's absence was no longer a quirk of the morning. It was a fact, heavy and undeniable, and it settled over the room with the weight of a storm that had only just begun to break. The hours before Detective Michael Hale vanished were traced with the kind of detail only an investigation can provide, pieced together from receipts, logs, and fragments of memory left behind. It began with a small slip of paper torn from the register at the dockside diner, a receipt for coffee and a plate of eggs time-stamped late in the evening. The waitress who worked the counter remembered him well, sitting in his usual booth near the window, coat folded neatly beside him, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She said he seemed tired, more withdrawn than usual, but not out of sorts. He had thanked her politely, left a larger tip than normal, and walked out into the night. That meal would become the last clear sighting of him alive. From there, the record moved to the police radio log, a single outgoing call placed to one of his informants. The exchange was short, little more than Hale asking for a meeting, and the informant agreeing. The time of that call was close to midnight, unusual but not unheard of for Hale, who often pressed his cases long after others had gone home. The informant was later questioned and claimed the meeting never happened, saying Hale never showed up. Investigators could not decide whether the denial was true or a shield to hide something more dangerous. Back at the station, the desk he left behind offered its own quiet testimony. On a yellow legal pad, underlined twice with heavy pressure, were the words, Blue Gull, 10 p.m. The handwriting was his, the ink fresh. The Blue Gull was not a street name or a contact anyone recognized at first. It was an old boathouse on the edge of the waterfront, abandoned for years but still standing with its roof sagging and its dock half collapsed into the tide. The note pointed directly there, as if Hale had known it was the next place he needed to be, or perhaps the last. The waterfront became the first grid of the search, Officers fanned out along the piers and alleys, questioning fishermen and night workers, their flashlights cutting across stacks of crates and the wet gleam of cobblestones. The smell of diesel and salt clung to everything, the sound of water slapping against the pilings filling the silence between questions. Yet no one claimed to have seen Hale that night. No one admitted to crossing paths with him along the darkened slips where the boats rocked in their berths. Investigators reconstructed the hours again and again, trying to close the gap between the diner, the phone call, and the note on his desk. It was only a few blocks of distance, a narrow stretch of city, yet somewhere in that short span, Hale had slipped from record into mystery. Each trace felt incomplete, a breadcrumb that ended just before the trail turned. His movements had been methodical, deliberate, but then the line went blank, leaving only the faint echo of his presence on paper and the cold certainty of his absence in flesh. At first light, the river looked calm, a broad sheet of dull silver under the rising sun, but those who worked its waters knew how quickly that calm turned treacherous. On the morning after Detective Michael Hale failed to appear, patrol officers launched small skiffs from the east bank, their outboard motors sputtering as they pushed against the slow current. The plan was simple in theory: sweep the main channel for signs of Hale's missing car or body, but nothing about the river ever made things simple. The silt ran thick, clouds of brown that swallowed light, and the water was cold enough to numb hands in minutes. Divers who pulled on their suits and tanks did so with the quiet focus of men about to enter a world where sight and sound gave little help. Sonar units were mounted on the patrol skiffs, their screens glowing faintly in the gray morning. Operators watched the scrolling images, as if reading tea leaves, tracing outlines of logs, pilings, and indistinct shapes that could have been anything from a sunken tire to a shadow of a hull long abandoned. Every blip raised hope for a moment. Every blur dragged the skiffs into a slow circle, as if by patience alone they might turn a shadow into a clue. More often than not, the promise of discovery dissolved into nothing, the sonar showing only driftwood carried down from upstream storms. Divers slipped into the water where the sonar suggested something heavier lay beneath. They moved slowly, tethered to the surface by ropes, their gloved hands sweeping through mud and weeds. The current pushed against their shoulders and the silt rose like smoke with each touch, turning the beam of their flashlights into faint, hazy cones. They searched by feel more than sight, running their hands over stones slick with algae, finding bottles, fishing gear, the skeletal frames of bicycles tossed from bridges. Every few minutes they surfaced, pulling off their masks, shaking their heads to the men waiting in the skiffs. Each shake deepened the silence on deck. As the day wore on, the search drew attention. Locals gathered on the banks, leaning on guardrails, watching the boats trace their patient grids. Whispers spread quickly, stories of men who had seen Hale near the docks, rumors of fights with shadowy figures, speculation that he had stumbled onto something too dangerous to survive. Fishermen muttered about seeing strange lights out on the water that week. Dock workers claimed to remember an unfamiliar truck idling by the piers. None of it could be confirmed, yet the river seemed to encourage the stories, its wide surface offering no answers of its own. By late afternoon, the current grew stronger, wind sweeping in from the bay, and the decision was made to suspend the dive teams until morning. The skiffs returned slowly to shore, motors humming low, their decks empty of evidence. Nothing had surfaced but driftwood and rumors, the river keeping whatever truth it held pressed deep beneath its shifting silt. The detectives watching from the bank understood what that meant. The water would not give up its secrets easily, and the search for Michael Hale was only beginning, pulled between procedure and the pull of a river that had already swallowed so much. Detective Nora Quinn stood in the doorway of Michael Hale's apartment with a face that revealed nothing. She wore thin gloves, the kind they used when walking into crime scenes, and though this was not one officially, she treated it with the same precision. The door had been unlocked by the landlord, the air inside stale and faintly carrying the smell of old coffee and dust. She paused for a moment, taking in the quiet. Hale's apartment was a simple place, clean but not sterile, the kind of space that suggested he spent more hours at the precinct than he ever did at home. A jacket was still draped over the back of a chair, a newspaper lay folded on the counter, the clock ticked in its steady rhythm. It looked like a man who had stepped out for groceries and would be back in minutes, only he had not come back, and his absence was now a wound spreading through the department. She moved carefully, eyes tracking every surface, every object. There was no suitcase missing from the closet, no overnight bag pulled from under the bed. His dresser drawers were full, clothes stacked in the exact order she had seen him keep them when he once invited her over for coffee after a late shift. His toothbrush stood by the sink, damp with use, the towel beside it hanging neatly. It was the apartment of someone who planned to return. If stories like this move you, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Quinn walked into the living room, her boots quiet on the worn carpet. His desk sat against the window, covered with papers arranged in Hale's typical order, everything squared to the edge. At the center was a case file spread open. She bent closer, scanning the pages. It was not one of their current assignments from the unit, not part of the robberies or narcotics leads they had been chasing that week. Instead, it was a string of bait shops down by the waterfront, all cash-only businesses, their ledgers scribbled with totals that made little sense. Hale had circled numbers, drawn arrows, written question marks in the margins. Receipts taped into the file showed him moving between them in the days before he vanished, quietly following some path of his own. There was no letter of resignation, no note to his family, no hint of a goodbye. Quinn pulled open drawers, checked under the bed, rifled through the fridge and pantry. Nothing suggested a man in crisis. Nothing pointed to escape. He had paid his bills, left his keys where they always were, even set aside his dry cleaning ticket. Everything about the apartment told her he had meant to come home, yet the file on the bait shop spoke of something else, a pursuit outside the lines of their official cases. Quinn leaned against the desk, staring at the open folder as the weight of the silence pressed in. She had worked beside Hale long enough to know his habits, his stubborn streak, the way he followed leads long after others would have dropped them. She understood then that whatever had pulled him into the night had not been an accident, nor a wandering of curiosity. It was deliberate, and now it had left nothing behind but questions scattered across paper and the stillness of a room waiting for its owner to return. The investigation turned next to the bait shops along the waterfront, small places that smelled of salt, engine oil, and the faint sweetness of dried minnows hanging in jars behind the counter. They were the kind of shops that had been there for decades, serving fishermen who knew the tides better than the clocks, shops that saw the same faces again and again. Hale's receipts placed him inside, 3 of them in the week before he disappeared, slips of paper stamped with dates and times, signed in his quick, slanted handwriting. To anyone else they would have seemed unremarkable, a detective buying coffee or spare line, but to Quinn they looked like deliberate markers, each one tying him to a pattern that had not yet been understood. The first shop was run by an old man with a heavy accent and hands that trembled when he counted change. He remembered Hale only because the detective had lingered near the door, asking questions that did not sound like a customer's small talk. Hale had asked about men who came late at night to buy bait but never carried rods, men who stayed only a few minutes before disappearing down the docks. The owner shrugged when Quinn pressed him, saying such men came and went, always paying in cash, never wanting conversation. The second shop was busier, a place with stacks of bright plastic buckets and rows of hooks and lures gleaming under fluorescent lights. The young clerk behind the counter remembered Hale clearly, not because of what he bought, but because of the way he carried himself. He asked about anglers who pulled up in cars with out-of-state plates, who never bought more than a token item, maybe a pack of gum or a soda, before heading straight to the back where the pier lights cut into the darkness. Hale had leaned on the counter, eyes sharp, jotting down notes as the clerk spoke. To her, it felt less like casual curiosity, and more like he was building a map no one else could see. The third shop sat on the edge of the river's bend, its sign faded, its shelves thin. The owner there said Hale had stopped by twice, once alone, and once with another man she did not recognize. She described Hale's questions in the same way as the others, quiet, precise, focused on men who came at hours when no fishing line was cast, men who carried coolers but no tackle. She had assumed Hale was investigating smuggling, perhaps drugs, perhaps stolen goods, but he had not explained, and she had not asked. What she did remember was the way he left, pausing at the doorway as if measuring the street, watching the shadows stretch down toward the river. Each of these visits painted the same picture, a detective following threads he had not yet shared with his partner or his unit. Quinn pieced it together as best she could, tracing his steps from one shop to the next, imagining him alone in the quiet of late nights, asking questions that made the owners uneasy. The receipts were small, almost meaningless on their own, but together they built a circuit, a route that Hale had traveled with purpose. It was a trail that ended abruptly with his disappearance, leaving behind only the echo of his questions about night anglers who never brought rods, and a sense that he had been closing in on something hidden in the darkness of the docks. The Blue Gull stood at the far end of the waterfront, a boathouse that had once served the shipping trade but now leaned into decay. Its paint had peeled to gray flakes, its roof sagged under years of storms, and its windows were clouded with grime that let in little light. A padlock hung on the front door, rusted and stiff, though not stiff enough to keep curious hands from breaking it open. The place was marked on no current registry. its name long stripped from maps, yet Hale had written it down on his pad as if he knew it still carried weight. When detectives first stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and old fuel filled the air, a stagnant odor of time passing without care. Dust coated the floor, but it was not undisturbed. Footprints cut through it in irregular trails, some deep and sharp, others faint as if days old. They led in from the door and scattered across the room toward the water side, a puzzle of directions that hinted at more than one visitor. Near a support beam, a small pile of cigarette ash rested in the dust, gray against gray, suggesting someone had stood there long enough to finish a smoke. The walls echoed with the faint groan of wood shifting, the sound of emptiness keeping secrets. Closer to the dock, the floorboards carried darker stains. One patch of oil smeared across the planks, wide enough that someone must have tried to wipe it away without success. The mark trailed into a streak that bent toward the open gap where the dock stretched out over the channel. It was here the dust broke into a clear story, drag marks etched into the surface, long grooves where something heavy had been pulled across the boards. The marks ended at the very edge of the dock, where the water lapped softly against the pilings. Whatever had been hauled stopped there, or else went into the river, claimed by the channel that carried ships in and out of the city. Detectives stood over those marks in silence, the weight of the scene pressing in. They imagined Hale meeting someone here, perhaps by arrangement, perhaps by ambush. The cigarettes suggested waiting, the oil suggested machinery, maybe a boat engine worked on in secret, and the drag marks whispered of something larger, something human. The shipping channel stretched wide and calm beyond the dock, its surface broken only by the wake of passing barges. Any object rolled into its depths would vanish quickly, carried away by tide and current. For Quinn, who walked the space with her gloves tight against her hands, the sight of Hale's handwriting on the note and the silence of this boathouse collided. He had been here, she felt sure, and whatever happened inside these walls had been sudden and violent. The Blue Gull was not just a derelict building but a stage, its floorboards recording the last act before Hale disappeared. The footprints, the ash, the smear of oil, and the drag marks told a story no one wanted to believe but could no longer ignore. The knock on the precinct door came in the evening, when most of the desks were already dark and only a few detectives remained hunched over paperwork. Nora Quinn looked up to see a woman standing uncertainly in the hallway, holding a cardboard box in her arms. She was pale from the effort of carrying it, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. This was Anna Hale, Michael's younger sister, and the box she clutched so tightly seemed to hold her whole history with him. She placed it on the nearest desk and pushed it gently forward. Inside were fragments of a life, keepsakes collected with no thought they would ever become evidence. There was a high school yearbook with his photo circled in pen, a leather wallet long since cracked, a fountain pen he had once carried during academy training, and a stack of birthday cards he had sent her over the years, each one written in his precise handwriting. She explained in a voice just above a whisper that she had gathered anything that might help, anything that might give the investigators some picture of who Michael was when he was not at work. Quinn listened, giving her time to arrange the pieces, and then Anna spoke of her fears. Michael had missed their mother's hospital checkup. He never missed those. Their mother had been frail for years, her appointments regular and predictable, and Michael had always appeared without fail, even if it meant showing up in his rumpled suit straight from a crime scene. When Anna walked into the waiting room and found only herself sitting beside their mother, she knew something was wrong. She tried to call him afterward, but the phone rang to silence, and later that night she heard the news that the squad could not reach him either. The box became a kind of stand-in for his presence, each object a reminder of his patterns and his devotion to family. Quinn sifted through the contents carefully, stopping at a photograph of Michael and Anna as children on a fishing pier, their father behind them smiling as he held up a line of small silver fish. Anna touched the edge of the photo with her fingertip, saying quietly that Michael had always hated the water. He went fishing because their father insisted, but he never trusted the river. It unsettled her to think that now, of all places, it was the river where they were searching for him. The detectives knew family members often sensed danger before anyone else. Anna's unease was not only grief but instinct, built from years of watching her brother's habits. She described how Michael called her after every late shift, just to check in, how he never left their mother without a word, how he had promised to be at her side during treatment no matter what. To her, the idea of him disappearing by choice was impossible. He was rooted to them by duty and love, and for him to vanish meant someone had severed that bond. The box sat open under the harsh fluorescent light, ordinary things transformed into silent testimony. Quinn thanked Anna, assuring her that nothing would be overlooked. Still, when Anna left, the precinct seemed quieter than before. the weight of her fears settling over every desk. The keepsakes were not just memories. They were reminders that Michael Hale was not a man who walked away. Whatever had taken him had torn him from the fabric of his family, leaving only a cardboard box to speak in his place. The first weeks of the search carried energy like a storm, every detective and officer certain that Michael Hale would be found if they just pushed hard enough. The task force worked late into the night, spreading maps across the walls of the precinct conference room until the plaster was hidden behind paper and pins. Colored threads traced possible routes he could have taken, tide charts were marked in heavy pen, photographs of the waterfront taped in neat rows. The air smelled of coffee gone cold and cigarettes stubbed out in overflowing ashtrays. In those early days, no one allowed themselves to believe Hale could simply vanish. Not one of their own, not a detective who had walked into danger 100 times and always come back. But as the weeks dragged on, the certainty began to erode. Each day ended with tired faces staring at the same boards, the same lines of red and blue stretching across the river grid. Dive teams had swept every corner, sonar had probed the dark silt, informants had been pressed until they refused to answer another question. Leads that once seemed solid crumbled into speculation, and speculation dissolved into silence. The boathouse at the Blue Gull offered no new trace. The bait shop owners had nothing more to give, and the river kept its secrets. By the second month, the task force began to feel the weight of futility. The budget bled steadily, overtime hours stacked high, and command grew restless. Other cases pressed for attention, robberies unsolved, narcotics shipments moving without interruption while their best detectives stared at maps that had nothing new to reveal. Morale sagged, the conviction that Hale would be found alive dimming into a quiet dread that maybe he never would be found at all. Officers stopped volunteering for late shifts on the case, stopped arguing over theories. The conference room grew quieter, the air less charged, the energy that once drove them replaced by a grinding fatigue. Nora Quinn kept coming back, refusing to let go of the pins and the tide charts. She would stand alone in the room long after others had gone, tracing her finger along the lines. Hale had walked in those last days, whispering questions no one could answer. She fought against the creeping thought that he was gone for good, telling herself over and over that a man like Hale did not simply slip away. Still, even she could feel the pull of resignation when the room grew empty, when the evidence boxes gathered dust at her feet. By the third month, the command staff made their decision. The task force would be dissolved, the case passed to cold storage, where older mysteries already lay. The conference room walls were stripped bare, the maps pulled down, the pins dropped into a cardboard box with a rattle that sounded too final. The label was written in black marker across a binder spine, Hale missing, just another file to be stored on a shelf among dozens like it. What had once been urgency and hope was reduced to paperwork, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. The department moved on, but those who had stood beside Hale knew the absence would not fade. It had built a wall inside them, a wall of unanswered questions that no amount of time could tear down. The spring of 1997 had been drier than usual, the kind of season that left lawns yellow and cracked and dropped the river lower than anyone could remember. Along the old ferry pylons, the water pulled back to reveal stones that had not seen the sun in years, slick with moss and streaked with rust from the metal posts driven deep into the channel. On a Saturday morning, two fishermen steered a small aluminum boat into the shadow of the pylons, the motor coughing before they cut it and let the anchor rattle down. The men had come not for mystery but for catfish, the kind that lurked in the slow brown current, fat and stubborn. They unpacked their rods and bait boxes, cracked open a pair of sodas, and settled into the stillness of the day. The river was quiet except for the creak of their boat and the occasional slap of a carp against the surface. The air smelled of mud and oil drifting from the shipyard downstream. One of the men leaned over to check his line when he felt it snag hard. Not the quick pull of a fish, but the heavy drag of something buried. He muttered, tugged, tried to reel it in, and the rod bowed under the weight. Together they worked the line, pulling hand over hand until something dark and misshapen broke the surface. It rose dripping and reluctant, coated in slime, a rectangle of corroded metal that caught the sun in dull flashes. They hauled it over the gunwale and dropped it onto the floor of the boat with a hollow clang. It was a tackle box, once red but now the color of rust and river stain. The hinges were stiff, the clasp fused shut with corrosion. One of the men pried at it with a pocket knife until the lid gave way with a brittle snap. Inside was a mess of lures turned to dust, spools of line hardened into knots, hooks clumped together in black decay. They laughed at first, disgusted by the smell, thinking they had wasted their effort on river junk. But then, beneath the ruined gear, something gleamed faintly through the grime. It was a badge, tarnished but intact, the numbers and letters still legible. D.E.T. Hale. The weight of the name settled over them in an instant. They both knew the story. Everyone in the city did. The detective who had vanished in 1983. The case that had gone cold despite years of searching. The fishermen stared at each other, the tackle box between them suddenly heavier than the river itself. One of them whispered that they should put it back, that nothing good ever came from finding things meant to stay hidden. The other shook his head and said no, they had to call it in. They wrapped the badge carefully in a rag and steered the boat back toward shore, their lines forgotten. The river flowed behind them as if nothing had changed. But in the bow of their boat lay the first piece of Michael Hale to surface in 14 long years. What began as a quiet morning of fishing had become the moment the past rose from the water, dripping, rusted, and undeniable. The tackle box came up slow, the line straining as if it carried not just weight but years of the river's grip. When it broke the surface, it did so in a cough of bubbles, mud, and weeds clinging to its sides, the metal lid almost orange with rust. The fishermen wrestled it into their boat, its bulk thudding against the aluminum hull with a hollow sound. At first they thought it was nothing but junk, another piece of debris dredged up from a riverbed littered with forgotten things. But the box had the feel of something sealed, as if it had been waiting. The lid was fused shut, the hinge eaten away by time. One man pried at it with his knife while the other held it steady, the blade slipping against the corroded seam. It took several tries, the metal groaning in protest, before the lock gave way with a brittle snap. The smell that escaped was of rot and iron, a damp sourness that filled the air. Inside, the trays and compartments were ruined. Hooks had fused into dark clumps, lures had dissolved into powdery green dust, spools of line had hardened into brittle nests. The tools of fishing were gone, reduced to relics by 14 years underwater. They sorted through the decay with cautious fingers, lifting fragments of gear that crumbled at their touch. Then, beneath one tray, lodged against the bottom of the box, something caught the light. It was not the dull color of rust, but the faint gleam of tarnished metal. The fishermen brushed away the grime and lifted it free. What they held in their hands was not a lure or a weight, but a shield, heavy and unmistakable. Its surface was dulled and scarred, but the engraving was clear enough to read. D.E.T. Hale. For a long moment neither man spoke. They stared at the badge as if it were a ghost, the name carrying a story that the whole city had once known. Michael Hale, the detective who vanished without a trace in 1983, the man whose absence had left a hollow in the department and a wound in his family. The case had faded into whispers, a file pushed onto a cold shelf. But here, in their boat, cradled in their hands, was the first piece of him to return. The fishermen looked at each other, their faces pale, the ordinary rhythm of their morning shattered. One of them said they should call someone right away, the police, the news, anyone who could take it from them. The other hesitated, staring at the badge, saying quietly that it felt wrong to hold, as if the river had given them something it had not meant to release. Still, they wrapped the shield carefully in an old rag and set it aside, the box sitting between them like a silent witness. The rest of their gear lay forgotten. As they turned the boat back toward shore, the tackle box rested heavy in the bow, its rusted shell still leaking river water. The badge inside was proof that Hale had been swallowed by the same waters they fished, and proof too that the river had kept his secret for 14 long years. What it had not yet given was the story of how it came to be there, a question that now weighed heavier than the box itself. The tackle box and badge were carried into the evidence room like fragile relics, sealed in thick plastic bags that dripped with the last of the river water. Officers handled them carefully, as if afraid the metal might crumble away in their hands. The chain of custody began there, signatures scratched onto forms, times noted down to the minute, each step marked so that no one could later question the path these items had taken. After 14 years of silence, no mistake would be allowed to taint what little the river had finally surrendered. At the lab, the smell was the first thing to hit, a sour mix of iron, algae, and decay that clung to the sealed bags even after they were opened. The technicians laid the box out under bright white lights, photographing it from every angle before touching anything. The rusted lid, the cracked hinges, the stains that striped the sides, all were recorded in precise detail. Only then did gloved hands begin the slow process of disassembling what remained. Each piece of corroded tackle was lifted out, bagged separately, tagged, and logged. Every object was given a number, no matter how ruined, because even the most useless fragment might one day prove important. The badge itself was treated like treasure. It was placed on a sterile tray, washed gently with distilled water, then dried under a stream of air so delicate it barely stirred the tarnish. The inscription remained visible, D-E-T-M. Hale. The letters darkened but still sharp against the dull metal. Photographs captured every scratch, every dent, every sign of the years it had endured beneath the current. For the technicians, it was not just an object, but the voice of a man who had been missing longer than some of them had been working. As the tackle box was stripped down layer by layer, small details emerged from the rot. Near the bottom of one tray, flakes of blue paint clung stubbornly to the rust. Under magnification, they looked recent, their color bright compared to the dull brown around them. The paint was scraped away and sealed in vials, its origin uncertain but promising. On the floor of the box, a strand of monofilament line remained intact, coiled loosely like a pale thread. It was brittle to the touch, but still strong enough to stretch before snapping. The technicians debated whether it had been used for fishing or tied for some other purpose, perhaps binding, perhaps fastening. It too was sealed and labeled. Then came the discovery that shifted the mood in the room. On the underside of the main tackle tray, hidden where no casual glance would find it, a faint number was stamped into the metal. Years of corrosion had not erased it. Under careful cleaning, the digits stood clear, part of a manufacturing code, the kind used to track production runs. The number was noted, photographed, and compared against records of old sporting goods suppliers. A path was opening, one that could lead to a specific store, a specific purchase, perhaps even a name. By the end of the day, the evidence table held rows of small bags, each one tagged and sealed, each one waiting for the slow grind of analysis. The tackle box that had been pulled from the river now sat empty, its secrets transferred piece by piece into the custody of the lab. The chain of custody formed its own story, not of the river's silence, but of human hands working to break it, tracing threads of paint, filament, and stamped numbers back toward the night when Detective Michael Hale vanished without a trace. The binder had sat for years on a shelf in the cold case archives, its spine marked only with a name and a date: Hale missing, 1983. Dust clung to the cardboard, the edges of the pages yellowing with time. When the fisherman pulled that rusted tackle box from the river, the file was lifted down, carried to the conference room with a silence that felt ceremonial. Officers gathered as if reopening a wound, the weight of memory and failure pressed into every page. The room changed almost overnight. Maps went up on the walls again, tide charts spread across corkboards, photographs of the waterfront pinned in neat rows. Red thread stretched from one point to another, drawing lines that had once been pulled down in defeat. The Blue Gull boathouse, long abandoned and left to rot, was sealed once more with bright tape, a scene revisited as if the years in between had never passed. Detectives walked its warped floorboards with flashlights, the dust disturbed again, the drag marks now faint scars but still visible if you knew where to look. Nora Quinn stood among them, no longer the partner waiting by the phone, but a lieutenant with gray in her hair and command in her voice. 14 years had not dulled her memory of that summer, the weeks when she had searched every corner of the city for Hale, only to watch the case collapse into silence. Now she asked for it back, not as a favor but as a right. She knew the file better than anyone, knew the habits of the man who had vanished, and she was unwilling to let someone else steer the course now that the river had finally returned a piece of him. Command hesitated, aware of the weight that came with reopening the case, but Quinn's insistence was steady. She had carried the absence all these years, and she was prepared to see it through. The squad room filled with the hum of renewed purpose. Younger detectives, many of whom had been children when Hale disappeared, studied the file with fresh eyes. They asked questions that once had no answers, piecing together the receipts, the bait shops, the note on his desk. Quinn guided them with the patience of someone who had walked those same lines before, pointing to the places where the trail had gone cold, reminding them of the mistakes that had cost the first investigation momentum. She reminded them, too, that Hale had been one of their own, and that duty meant refusing to let his story remain unfinished. Outside, the river kept flowing, indifferent to the new surge of energy, but inside the precinct the air felt alive again, as if time had folded back to 1983, as if the empty chair at roll call might finally have an answer. The old case was no longer just a binder gathering dust. It was a living investigation again, with tape across the boathouse door, pins stuck into maps, and a lieutenant who had waited half her career to return to the trail of her missing partner. The lab work began in quiet rooms far from the water, where the smell of rust and river mud still clung to the tackle box even after it had been dried and sealed. Under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, technicians scraped flakes of corrosion from the lid and sides, placing them under glass. The rust told its own kind of story, a slow record of years spent underwater. By measuring the depth of the corrosion, the way it layered across the steel and aluminum. They could place the box in the river, not just for a season, but for more than a decade. A timeline that aligned with Hale's disappearance in 1983. It was as if the metal itself confirmed what the department had long suspected, that the river had been holding a secret since the night he vanished. Silt was pulled from the seams of the box, packed into vials, and compared under microscopes. The grains were matched against samples from across the channel, each slice of riverbed carrying its own signature of mineral content and density. The results pointed not to the wide current near the ferry pylons where the fishermen had hauled it up, but to a quieter slice of river downstream from the Blue Gull. That stretch of water had long been avoided by casual boaters, its floor uneven, the current tricky, the silt prone to swallowing what sank into it. The match was strong enough to suggest that the box had started there, resting in the mud near the boathouse, before drifting downstream over the years to where it was finally caught. The stamped number on the underside of the tray, faint but still visible, gave the investigation its first concrete lead. Technicians cleaned the marking carefully until the digits came clear, then sent them through manufacturing databases. Hours later, a record surfaced, tying the number to a discontinued model of tackle box sold in limited supply during the late 70s. The distributor was a local name, Rooker's Bait, HA Fuel, a shop that had served fishermen along the waterfront for decades. Records showed that model had not been sold anywhere else in the city. Detectives gathered around the report with a mix of weariness and hope. For years they had lived with nothing but theories, and now the metal, the mud, and the stamped code had delivered something solid. The tackle box was no longer just debris. It was an artifact that tied Hale's disappearance to a specific place and a specific seller. Quinn read the details slowly, her lips pressed tight. She remembered Rooker's, remembered that Hale had asked questions about its night customers in the days before he vanished. The circle was tightening, the same names and places returning after all these years. In the forensics lab, the evidence lay catalogued in neat rows of plastic bags, each one holding rust flakes, silt samples, or the fragments of tackle reduced to dust. Together they built a map that stretched from the Blue Gull to Rooker's, from the murk of the riverbed to the ledger books that might still hold forgotten entries. The science did not provide answers to what had happened on that night in 1983, but it gave the squad a place to stand, a way to move forward. Metallurgy and mud had succeeded where rumor and memory had failed, and for the first time in years, the silence of the river felt as though it might finally be broken. Rooker's Bait, HA. Fuel had not changed much in the years since Hale had walked through its doors. The paint on the sign had faded, the glass counters were clouded with scratches, and the air still smelled of gasoline, worms, and damp wood. Behind the register, tucked under a drawer that squeaked when it opened, the old paper books had survived. They were thick ledgers bound in worn covers, each page lined with rows of careful handwriting. Dust clung to their edges, but the ink remained dark, the columns of numbers still legible after decades. When the books were pulled into the light of the squad room, it felt as though the past had stepped forward and placed its hand on the table. The entries were simple at first glance, lists of bait sales, fuel purchases, soda bottles, and candy bars. But when detectives leaned closer, patterns began to show. Cash totals rose and fell with the seasons, steady through summer fishing months and quieter in winter. Yet, every so often, the numbers spiked without reason. Nights when the moon had vanished into darkness, totals doubled or tripled, far more than what worms and minnows could explain. The handwriting remained steady, no sign of error, no corrections, as if someone had been careful to hide the unusual within the ordinary. Further down the page, the detectives found a line written without flourish, just 2 words that carried more weight than anything else in the book: rent lockers. It appeared again and again, always connected to those moonless nights, always written on line 4 of the page as though that position had been chosen deliberately. No addresses or details were offered, only the suggestion that someone was paying for hidden space, storage not listed anywhere else. The ledgers became less a record of bait and fuel and more a coded diary of transactions never meant to be read by police. Names were scrawled beside the entries, but most were code, initials, and nicknames that revealed little. Detectives traced them through records, searching for overlaps with known smugglers or dockside workers, but the trail grew thin. Only one name stood out, repeated just enough to matter, written more clearly than the others as though it carried authority. It belonged to a harbor pilot, a man whose reputation in the city was one of reliability and respect. His job was to guide cargo ships safely through the channel, a role trusted by both company and Coast Guard. In public life, he was clean, a family man with no arrests, no debts, no whispers of scandal. But in the ledger, his name appeared quietly in connection with the lockers, tethered to those moonless nights when cash flooded into rookers. Quinn read the entry aloud, her voice low, the name heavy in the air. The room fell into silence, the detectives exchanging uneasy glances. The pilot had been invisible to them all these years, too respectable to suspect, too ordinary to question. Yet here he was, written in ink on a page that had survived 14 years beneath dust and neglect. The ledger gave no explanations, only hints, but it was enough. For the first time since the badge had surfaced from the river, the investigation had a living name, a man who had walked the docks while Hale disappeared. The ledger had preserved what memory and rumor had forgotten, and with it came the possibility of answers that had long been denied. The divers went into the water before dawn, their breath rising in white plumes as they prepared their gear on the deck of the patrol boat. The stretch of river chosen for the search was narrow and unwelcoming, its surface calm, but its depths unpredictable. It was the slice of riverbed identified by the lab, the silt there matching what had been scraped from the tackle box. Spotlights cut across the dark water as the first diver dropped in, the cold swallowing him whole. The rope at his waist tightened, then eased, as he descended slowly into the mud and silence below. The bottom was murk and shadow, a world without horizon. Each movement stirred clouds of silt that swallowed the beam of the diver's light, leaving him with no more than a foot of visibility. He moved carefully, sweeping his hands across the riverbed, feeling more than seeing. The others followed, spreading out in a slow fan, their lines tethered to the surface like threads connecting them to air and safety. Above, the technicians on deck marked their positions on a chart, radios crackling with muted voices. Hours passed with nothing but bottles, broken wood, and the rusting skeletons of machines dumped decades earlier. Then one diver felt the hard edge of something different, a shape half buried in the mud. He brushed gently until the outline came clear, a small metal object wrapped tight in electrical tape, the adhesive still clinging despite the years. He secured it and sent it up along the tether, where gloved hands pulled it into the boat. In the light of the deck lamps it was revealed. A locker key, old but intact, its teeth sharp, its number faint but legible. The tape had preserved it, as if someone had intended it to survive the river's reach. Minutes later, another discovery surfaced. A section of rope, thick and coarse, lay coiled in the muck, one end frayed and shredded. Forensic eyes on deck recognized the pattern immediately. Fibers twisted by prop wash, torn apart by the pull of a boat's engine. It spoke of something bound and dragged, something heavy cut loose when the strain became too great. The divers continued, widening their search around the point where the key and rope had been found. In the pale arc of their lights they uncovered a mark in the mud, a curve carved deep into the riverbed. It was wide, too smooth to be natural, a depression shaped by weight pressing down for years before being shifted or removed. The arc was pale against the darker silt, a ghostly outline of absence. Whatever had lain there had been large and solid, resting until currents or hands had moved it on. When the divers surfaced, shivering and exhausted, they knew they had touched the edges of something larger than debris. The key, the rope, and the arc in the mud were not random finds but fragments of a single story, one that stretched back to the night Michael Hale disappeared. The river had not given up everything, but it had left impressions, shadows of what once rested in its silence. On deck, Quinn watched the items bagged and tagged, her jaw set tight. For years, the river had refused to speak. Now, in pieces and traces, it was beginning to tell them where to look next. The key they had pulled from the river fit the lock under Pier 5 as if it had been waiting all those years. The storage unit was hidden beneath the pier's skeleton, wedged between thick pilings, slick with barnacles. The metal door was rusted but intact, its handle cold and gritty in the detective's hands. When the key turned and the latch gave way, the door swung open with a groan, the smell of brine and mildew spilling out. Flashlights cut through the gloom, beams catching on crates stacked low against the walls, and a scatter of canvas bags left to sag with age. It was not an empty locker. It was a vault of secrets. The first thing removed was a roll of oilskin maps, their surfaces wrinkled but still legible, protected from the worst of the damp. Spread across the squad room table later, the maps revealed markings along the river channel, notes in cramped handwriting that matched no official survey. Red ink traced narrow inlets, isolated pilings, and coded symbols near certain docks. Someone had charted routes that avoided patrol eyes, paths through the water that only a pilot or smuggler could have known. Beside the maps lay a packet wrapped in waxed paper, a timetable written out in columns. Dates and tides aligned with moonless nights, the very nights the rookers' ledgers had shown unexplained spikes in cash. Each line carried initials or nicknames, paired with amounts that hinted at deliveries. To anyone else, it might have looked like shipping schedules, but to the detectives it was a smuggler's calendar, proof that the river had been a highway for more than fish and ferries. Then came the photographs. Polaroids curled with time, edges yellowed, but their images still sharp enough to wound. The first showed the shadow of a meeting at the water's edge, two figures standing near the pylons with the river stretching behind them. In one, Michael Hale was clear, his windbreaker zipped to the throat, his posture upright, face half turned toward the camera. He looked unaware he was being photographed, his expression caught between caution and intent. In another frame, a second man appeared, standing just enough in profile to suggest familiarity. The angle was poor, the light dim, but the outline of his jaw, the curve of his shoulder, marked him as someone who could be recognized if you had seen him before. Quinn studied the images with steady hands, her face unreadable. She had carried Hale's absence for 14 years, and now she looked at proof that he had been alive the night he went missing, caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than a quiet investigation into bait shops. The other man's half-turned face burned into the detective's eyes. A ghost caught on film. The kind of evidence that pulled a case out of theory and planted it in the realm of fact. The locker under Pier 5 closed again with a hollow sound, but the contents had already changed the investigation. The maps, the timetable, the photographs, each item told a piece of the story. Hale had stepped into the river's shadows, willingly or not, and someone had been there with him. Someone who had left enough of himself behind to be recognized when the time came. The harbor pilot sat in the windowless room with his hands folded neatly on the table, the sleeves of his uniform shirt rolled up, his face calm in a way that looked rehearsed. The detectives across from him slid the Polaroids across the table, the edges curling under the fluorescent light. He glanced at them, lifted one with 2 fingers, and set it down again as if it meant nothing. He denied knowing Michael Hale, denied ever meeting him on the riverfront, denied any connection beyond the ordinary duties of his job. His voice was steady, even courteous, but there was a stiffness to the way he held his shoulders, as though bracing for a storm. Quinn leaned forward, her tone measured, reminding him of the ledger entries, the ones that listed his name beside nights when the river swelled with hidden traffic. She spoke of the key found in the mud, the locker beneath Pier 5 filled with maps and timetables, the photographs that placed a man of his, build and bearing, at Hale's side. The pilot's answers never wavered. He said ledgers could be mistaken, keys could be planted, photographs could mislead. He insisted he had been at home on the night Hale disappeared, that his wife had seen him, that his life was as clean as the ships he guided through the channel. For hours, the room filled with the rhythm of questions and denials, a cycle that seemed unbreakable. The pilot sipped water, adjusted his watchband, and stared at the table rather than the detectives. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed reputation would shield him, that his years of service on the water meant his word would outweigh fragments of paper and grainy photographs. The crack came not from him but from the outside. A dock worker, called in by Quinn's team to answer routine questions, remembered something he had never thought important before. He described the night when the tide ran fastest, the water dragging hard against the pilings, the same night Hale was last traced to the Blue Gull. The worker had been on a late shift, stacking crates near the waterfront road, when he noticed a truck idling by the boathouse. The make and color were clear in his memory. The way the headlights cut across the dock, the steady hum of the engine. It was the pilot's truck, the same one he still drove, with its dented fender and the company decal faded on the door. When the statement reached the interrogation room, Quinn laid it on the table without ceremony. The pilot's composure faltered, just slightly. A shift in his jaw, a pause before he answered. He said the worker must have been mistaken, that many trucks looked alike in the dark, that memory after 14 years could not be trusted. But the denial carried less strength now, his voice thinner, his shoulders tighter. The room no longer belonged to him. Quinn did not press harder than necessary. She knew the power of a single witness who remembered something ordinary and small, something that fit into the gaps left by silence. The pilot had built his life on routine and trust, but the memory of a dock worker and the hum of his truck on the night the tide pulled hardest threatened to unravel it all. For the first time since he sat down, the weight of the room shifted, and the harbor pilot understood that the story he had carried for years was beginning to fracture. The storm came hard and sudden, hammering the waterfront with sheets of rain that blurred the lights on the piers and drove waves against the pilings until the boards groaned. Wind roared down the channel, rattling the loose metal siding of the old boathouses and tearing branches from the banks. For a night the river was no longer still but a churning mass of brown water, breaking loose what it had held for years. When the storm finally moved on, leaving the sky washed pale and the air raw with salt. The current carried something unexpected to the surface. It was a shape caught in the shallows, wedged against a shelf of silt where the water had thinned. At first it looked like nothing more than wreckage, another piece of forgotten junk dredged up by the violence of the storm. But when patrol boats moved in closer, their searchlights fixed on the outline, it became clear this was a car. The front end was driven deep into the mud, the rear just visible above the surface, a rusted frame coated with weeds. Chains were looped around the chassis and winches strained until the vehicle was dragged free of the water's grip, rising in a shower of silt and debris. The car was an unmarked Ford, the same model issued to detectives in the early 80s. Its windows were gone, the body pitted and eaten by rust, but enough remained to identify what it had once been. The discovery sent a shiver through the squad room when the news came in. For years they had wondered where Hale's car had gone, whether it had been hidden, stripped, or driven far from the city. Now here it was, nose down in the river, delivered by the storm. At the forensic garage, the car was examined inch by inch. Mud was shoveled from the trunk and the interior scrubbed free of weeds before the real work began. Inside the trunk they found strands of fabric, faint but unmistakable, fibers that matched the tarps once used at the Blue Gull. The weave and dye were compared to samples taken during the original search, and the match was near certain. Under the black light, faint stains were revealed on the trunk lining. Tests confirmed the presence of blood, degraded but still carrying enough markers to match Hale's type. Not proof of identity, but proof enough that violence had touched the space. Among the debris in the trunk lay a single tackle tray, metal warped and corners bent, but otherwise intact. It was identical in style and design to those from the box recovered by the fishermen, only this one was empty, stripped of its gear. The discovery closed the loop between the river, the boathouse, and the tackle box. The pieces were not scattered by chance but linked, fragments of a single story that had been waiting to surface. When Quinn looked at the car, she saw more than rust and river rot. She saw Hale's final drive, the path that ended in silence beneath the water. The Ford had not gone missing on its own. Someone had forced it into the channel, nose first, trunk weighted with secrets. The storm had pried it loose, but the evidence it carried was the river's own confession, fibers, blood, and a tray that tied everything together. It was the car that had been missing for 14 years, and it was telling them at last that Hale had never left the waterfront alive. The story of that night in 1983 was rebuilt not from memory but from fragments, each detail recovered from the river, the ledger, and the scattered words of witnesses who had not known what they were seeing at the time. The reconstruction unfolded piece by piece until the sequence felt almost certain. Hale had gone to the Blue Gull with purpose, his note on the desk naming the place, his questions at the bait shop circling the same trail. He was following something he had nearly closed in on, a source who promised him answers. In the dark stillness of the boathouse, he met that source, and from him he learned the truth, that the harbor pilot who guided ships through the channel was not just ferrying cargo but running money and bodies upriver under the cover of night. The boathouse itself bore the marks of what came next. The cigarette ash showed waiting, the oil stains showed movement, and the drag marks carved into the dust spoke of a struggle. Hale, trained and determined, must have confronted the pilot, pressed him for more, perhaps threatened to bring it back to the squad. The pilot, cornered in his own hidden space, reacted not with words but with force. A shove in the wrong direction was enough, Hale's skull striking against the timber beam, the sound sharp and final in the cavernous dark. The weight of that moment lingered in the smear of oil, the silence that followed when Hale crumpled. Panic took over then. The pilot had no time for careful choices. He dragged Hale's body across the planks, the marks still etched faintly into the boards years later, ending at the edge of the dock where the tide lapped. He pulled the detective's car close, lifted him into the trunk, slammed it shut. The car itself became part of the cover, rolled nose first down the slope into the current, swallowed quickly by the silt and water. It sank in silence, the river's mud wrapping it tight, and for 14 years it lay unseen until the storm tore it loose. But there was one act that did not fit with panic, one choice that spoke of deliberate thought. Somewhere in those final moments, before the river claimed the car, Hale had hidden his badge, slipped it into the tackle box and pushed it beneath lures and line, as though leaving behind a flare for whoever might one day find it. Whether he did so before the blow, sensing danger, or in the seconds after, wounded but aware, no one could say. What mattered was that he placed it there, not as surrender, but as testimony, a name and a number pressed into tarnished metal, waiting for the day it would resurface. The reconstruction was not perfect, no story built from fragments ever is, but it gave shape to the silence. Hale had gone to the Blue Gull searching for truth, and in that search he collided with the man who had turned the river into a corridor for crime. A shove, a skull on timber, a hurried trunk job, a car rolled into the current, and a badge hidden not to be lost but to be found. That was the night of 1983, stripped of rumor, rebuilt from evidence, the night when Michael Hale's life ended and his mystery began. The charges landed with the weight of years behind them. The case built from rust, silt, and scraps of paper no one thought would ever matter again. The harbor pilot stood in court with his head bowed, his uniform stripped from him, his reputation gone. What began as denial unraveled into quiet negotiation, his lawyers pressing for survival rather than vindication. In the end, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter and conspiracy, words that flattened a night of panic and violence into legal terms. The sentence was long enough to close the door on his freedom, yet not enough to balance what had been taken. The city watched as one of its trusted guides was led away in handcuffs, the same hands that once steered ships now bound together. For the department, the conclusion brought no celebration. Detectives stood in the squad room staring at the empty chair that had belonged to Hale, remembering the weeks when maps covered the walls and pins marked their hopes. Justice, such as it was, had come too late to feel whole. 14 years had passed since Hale walked into the Blue Gull, 14 years in which his name had been spoken in whispers and his case filed away in dust. The pilot's conviction answered the question of who, but it could not return the man who had carried those questions in life. A memorial service was held in the precinct courtyard, the flag lifted high above rows of uniforms. Quinn stood at the front, her posture rigid but her eyes heavy with memory. She spoke of Hale not as a case file but as a partner, a man who worked until his hands shook from exhaustion, who never missed his mother's appointments, who carried a stubborn sense of duty like armor. The chaplain's words followed, naming the loss that could never be replaced, reminding those gathered that service meant stepping into shadows where danger waited. Hale's sister held herself together as she walked forward to receive the badge. It had been cleaned of the river's rot, polished enough that the engraving shone once more, but no amount of work could erase the scars etched into its surface. Scratches ran across the shield like a record of its years in the dark. The evidence tag had been removed, replaced by a small velvet box, yet everyone who watched knew it was both things at once, evidence of a crime and elegy for a life cut short. She closed her hand around it and pressed it against her chest, a gesture that carried grief and pride in equal measure. After the service ended, the crowd thinned, uniforms scattering back to their duties, their voices low. The river continued its slow course nearby, indifferent to the ceremony, the same water that had hidden Hale's car, his badge, and his story for so long. It flowed past as though nothing had changed, carrying barges and gulls on its surface, its silence unbroken. Yet for the people who had gathered, for Quinn and for Hale's sister, the river would never again be just water. It was a grave and a witness, and though it ran indifferent, they carried its memory like a tide inside them.